I get it, you're standing in the middle of the living room, remote in hand, scrolling through endless options, and the thought of spending a few $100s on a receiver that might end up gathering dust is honestly nerve-wracking. You've probably already watched a couple of YouTube walkthroughs, read a handful of spec sheets, and maybe even asked a friend who's already set up a home theater. The fear of overpaying for a box that sounds great on paper but falls flat when you finally press play is real. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I started digging into the Sony STR AN1000, the first thing that stood out was the promise of 8K HDMI 2.1 support paired with Dolby Atmos and DTS. That's a lot of tech buzz, but what does it actually mean for a family that watches a mix of streamed movies, occasional 4K Blu-rays, and a bit of gaming? In practice, the receiver is built to handle a wide variety of sources without you having to constantly swap cables or worry about compatibility. The 6 HDMI inputs and 2 outputs give you room for a TV, a console, a streaming stick, and a Blu-ray player, while still leaving a pass-through for a projector or a secondary display. For most people, that eliminates the "where does this go" headache that shows up with smaller receivers that only have 2 or 3 HDMI ports. Now, let's talk about the day-to-day experience. I set up a modest 7.2 channel speaker layout in a 20-foot living room, using 2 bookshelf speakers in the front, a center channel, 2 surround speakers, and a pair of upward-firing Dolby Atmos modules. The STR AN1000's 165 watt per channel rating at 6 ohms is enough to drive those speakers without the need for an external amp, which is a huge plus if you're trying to keep the system simple. When I launched a Netflix 4K HDR title, the picture quality on my 8-capable TV was crisp, and the sound filled the room with clear dialogue and a surprisingly nuanced surround field. The built-in digital cinema auto calibration, the 9 system, ran a quick mic test and automatically set speaker distances, levels, and crossover points. I was surprised at how fast it completed, under 5 minutes, and the result was a balanced soundstage that didn't require me to sit down with a spreadsheet of measurements. One of the practical strengths that often gets lost in the marketing copy is the connectivity beyond HDMI. Sony has integrated Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, Chromecast built-in, and Spotify Connect directly into the receiver. In my household, that means I can toss a Spotify playlist from my phone to the receiver without having to fire up the TV or a separate smart speaker. The Wi-Fi module also lets you use Sony's Music Center app to control volume, switch inputs, or even set up a multi-room configuration with Sonos devices, which is a neat trick if you already own a Sonos soundbar or speaker in another part of the house. The receiver essentially becomes the hub of your whole audio ecosystem. There are, however, a few hidden trade-offs you should be aware of before you decide to pull the trigger. First, the receiver's 360 spatial sound map feature promises immersive audio, but it relies heavily on proper speaker placement and a room that can accommodate upward-firing modules. In a smaller apartment with low ceilings, those Atmos speakers can bounce sound off the floor and create a muddy bass response instead of the clean height effects you'd expect. If you don't have the space to position speakers at least a couple of feet from the walls, you might not reap the full benefit of the Atmos processing. Second, the receiver's power consumption spikes when you're cranking up the volume for a movie night. While it's not a deal-breaker, you'll notice the fan turning on louder than you might expect, especially during extended high-volume sessions. For most users, that's just a mild annoyance, but if you're a night owl who likes to binge movies after everyone's asleep, the extra noise could be a consideration. Another practical point is the user interface. Sony's on-screen menus are clean, but navigating through the myriad of audio presets can feel a bit dense if you're not familiar with terms like Dolby Atmos Height Virtualizer or DTS Neural X. The remote does have dedicated buttons for common functions, but digging into the more advanced settings typically requires a few extra clicks and, honestly, a quick glance at the manual. If you're the type who wants everything to be plug-and-play with a single button press, you might find the learning curve a little steeper than with some competitor models that hide the complexity behind a single cinema button. So, who should walk away with this receiver, and who might look elsewhere? If you already own a decent set of speakers, want a future-proof HDMI 2.1 hub, and enjoy streaming music from multiple sources without buying an extra amp or a dedicated streaming box, the STR AN1000 is a solid match. It shines for households that have a mix of 4K and 8K content, a gaming console that can push 120Hz, and a